everyone. My name is Emma. Welcome to Date with an Author. We are joined today by Emily Murphy, all the way from California. She's a creator of Pass the Pistol blog, which includes DIY recipes and projects, etc. Has been featured on NBC's Today, Marilyn and Dennis shows, and has written for Better Homes and Gardens, the Saturday Evening Post, Mother Earth News, and Pacific Horticulture. She is the author of the book, Grow What You Love. And today we're going to be spending time talking about her new book, Grow Now, How We Can Save Our Health, Communities, and Planet One Garden at a Time. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
We're happy to have you, and we're going to be doing a little bit of a compost interactive segment later, a demonstration with some and provide some resources, talk a little bit of background. But first of all, one of the most powerful things you say at the beginning of your book, and I quote, "I've learned that there's something wonderfully powerful in the simple act of growing. Here in our gardens, we can repair ourselves in our plots of earth with our own two hands." With this sentiment going forward, I think that's a big theme in your book. Can you give us a summary and elevator pitch about your book?
Yeah, so Grow Now looks at climate activism through growing and also how we can support biodiversity through that process, which really climate activism through growing is the long haul gain on this process. The immediate gain is this support of biodiversity, which impacts our personal health as well as the planet's health, beginning within our communities, which is key. And so this book, Grow Now, it looks very directly at how we can rewild our food systems, rewild our communities, what that means through the regenerative process, and how we can go beyond organic. And I dive into that quite deeply, along with providing how-tos, of course, for growing a garden, whether that's in a food garden or landscape. And then also weave in, of course, the whys for doing this. So not just the how-tos, but the why-tos.
Great. And can you tell us how you ended up dedicating your life and dedicating books and a blog to this subject matter?
Yeah, so I was really lucky to grow up around a community of gardeners. And this, of course, it first included my family. I remember quite clearly sitting next to my grandmother when she was gardening, and I was trying to help, but really I was playing and, watching the butterflies and learning to garden, what I like to call learning to garden through osmosis. And her garden was this really unique place. It was in the foothills of California, quite near the coast. And while this might seem counterintuitive, it's an area that was considered a rainforest because it received over 100 inches of rain a year. Still Northern California with the summer dry climate. But she had this garden. She was a first generation Italian living in first generation Italian living in the US. Her parents immigrated from Italy, and her garden reflected this sort of Italian, what you'd imagine from an Italian Prata, Italian garden with grapevines and food plants mixed with flowers. She had chickens, but outside the gate of her garden was the wild, and the foothills were where oak woodlands and redwoods met, and at the top of the hill you could look down and see the ocean. So for me, this childhood experience of cultivated and wild were very intermixed and very much a part of each other. And I took this through my life. I was lucky enough to have other garden mentors. I studied ethnobotany, environmental science, soil ecology in college, also studied pedagogy, teaching, education, and garden design, photography, you name it. I just kind of brought it all together as a way to really begin examining beauty, finding beauty, creating beauty, and also meaning through growing and food, all the layers of life, and what, I guess, honestly, what brought me joy and others joy. And then through time, I realized, okay, Grow What You Love was a really great book. It looks at 12 sets of seasonal ingredients to change your life and your cooking. It was sort of my homage to my family. But then I realized, okay, I really need to go further. And that's where Grow Now was born. Growing a garden is important, but but why is it important? How does the simple act of growing impact soil, impact our lives? And how can we then grow resilient communities just by reframing what we do and reframing how we think about things? And that's really what Grow Now does for us.
That's great. That sounds like a really great childhood to get to interact with your grandma's garden and to learn from that. And that sounds like a great idea for a follow-up. I'm so happy you followed up with this book, because especially now it's such an important topic to know why we need to change our habits when it comes to our yards. So yeah, you mentioned a lot of great concepts, and some concepts might be new to some people. I want to quote you again, because you have a lot of great quotes in this book. Once you begin participating in the act of growing, you'll discover it's a deeply personal process, one that fosters your inherent kinship with nature. When you nurture your small piece of earth, it nurtures you back. This book is your roadmap, guiding you with nature-based solutions for regenerating soil, fostering biodiversity, and mitigating climate crisis. So right in there, we have a lot of different concepts, and you mentioned this, and it's mentioned in the quote. Firstly, what is biodiversity? You talk a lot about it in the book and how it's important for gardening.
Right. So biodiversity is a word I'm sure many of your audience at the library, many people who come to the library, patrons, have heard, especially more lately in the news around, say, species extinction and the biodiversity crisis. Biodiversity on the whole is really a look at organisms that live on our planet, and the ecological relationships of those organisms is really what Grow Now addresses. And the biodiversity issue is that we are facing the sixth mass extinction since the time of the dinosaurs. We're looking at a loss of 25% of life on Earth. That's 1 million organisms in plant and animal species in the coming decades, which is quite frightening when you start to drill down as to what that really means and how it impacts us personally, besides the fact that this is our home planet, and how we got to this point of biodiversity loss as a whole. And what we know is that the root cause for species extinction or the loss of biodiversity is very much the same root cause as the climate crisis. And it only then makes sense that the solutions for the climate crisis and the loss of biodiversity are also very much the same. These nature-based solutions of caring for soil, considering the plants that we grow, rewilding our food systems through these regenerative practices. And one of the concepts I dive deeply into in the first couple of chapters is how this impacts us. Okay, it's great that we're considering biodiversity on the planet. It's important, but what does it have to do with me? And what I point out is it has everything to do with each of us, that we're only as healthy as the environments in which we live, and the biodiversity outside of us is a reflection of the biodiversity within us. And I talk about this in relationship to the biodiversity hypothesis, which really looks at microbes, so biodiversity on that microbial level, which I know might be going a little bit deep, but when we think about the use of probiotics, say, and gut health, which are really, really popular topics for personal health. And we get those microbes other than, say, from probiotics and the foods we eat, right? That might be living foods, such as fermented foods, from our environments, first from our mothers, then from our environment, of course, also from the food that we eat. And as the biodiversity of our planet decreases, so too does the biodiversity of our bodies. And why does this matter? Well, again, I go into this quite deeply in the book around the biodiversity hypothesis and the studies that have been done.
Well, one aspect I thought was interesting. So you say, and again, I quote, biodiversity begets biodiversity. So once you stimulate biodiversity, it really stimulates more biodiversity. And you also talk about this give and take system that I think would be interesting for people to learn about, how one species survival often depends on the health of another species. Do you have an example of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So monarch butterflies is is a species that most people are familiar with, and many people probably who are watching this know that monarch butterflies have a very specific relationship with their host plant, which is milkweed. And there are many different types of milkweed, but milkweed is the only plant upon which they lay their eggs, and the monarch butterfly caterpillars then feed on in the process of becoming an adult. And once they're adults and they're butterflies and they're flying about, they can feed or forage for nectar from any number of plants that are butterfly friendly, but they require the milkweed plant as their sole host plant. And there's another quote in the back of the book. Maybe I'll pull it out really quickly, and I think this speaks to something that or speaks to your question. I need my glasses though to see it. So, and oftentimes I find that when I am beginning a new book, particularly a nonfiction book, I'll go to the back of the book to help me understand where that book is going. What is the ethos or the intended outcome that then will help me understand the book leading up to the end of the book. And at the end of the book, it talks about the butterfly effect. An idea known as the butterfly effect reminds us of the hidden connections of all things, suggesting that the flapping of a butterfly's wings has the potential to influence the path of a typhoon halfway around the globe. And while this analogy may be an exaggeration, there's something to it. Tiny acts have big impacts in our personal lives and in the world. And the interconnection of all things includes us, the tiny acts that we're going to talk about today, but it also speaks to the interconnection of all things ecologically, that when, say, we plant a milkweed plant, we're then creating this cascade of positive effects for wildlife, not just for monarch butterflies, but for all the other insects and birds that might be visiting, because it's a really important plant, along with so many other plants. And that's not just for biodiversity above ground, it's for biodiversity below ground, because what we know, and we know is that microbes in soil, various fungi, bacteria, and other microbes, as well as insects and other animals, have relationships with specific plants, and their specific relationships below ground and above ground. And so the more biodiversity we plant in our landscapes, the more biodiversity we foster below ground and above ground. And when we consider the interconnection of all things, these ecological webs of life, and we respect those webs, we can then support species like monarch butterflies and so many other species that are clearly interdependent. Some are more generalist, and begin fostering biodiversity on the whole, which again benefits us, which I talk about more in the book as well.
That's great. I'm glad you touched on the butterfly effect, because I think a lot of us know it as the movie, and a lot of people don't realize that it's an actual theory, and it's really beautiful how you touch on that in the book. But you brought up butterflies. Moving on to pollinators, this is a perfect segue. What are pollinators, and what are some examples of different types of pollinators? Why are they important?
Right, great question. So you're right. There's many different types of pollinators. Bats are one important pollinator. Insects of all kinds, of course, bees, butterflies, certain birds, hummingbirds in particular, and other insects too that we might not consider pollinators, such as ladybugs. We think of ladybugs as strictly predators, and we love it when they visit our gardens because they're eating aphids, and there's this fabulous balance between good bugs and bad bugs, which allows us to grow our gardens beyond organic without the use of pesticides and herbicides and synthetic fertilizers. So there are any number of pollinators, and what they're doing really is they're just moving pollen about. And so they might not be there for the pollen, they might be there for the nectar, most likely. And the pollen happens to rub off on their bodies, and when they go to the next flower, that pollen is then transferred with them. And it's how nature, I mean, the interconnection of all things, considering how pollinators work, is really incredible how nature grows itself.
Yeah, it's a beautiful relationship that you depict in the book, and I mean, where would we be without it? So, yeah, thank you for explaining that. And you've mentioned the terms rewilding and regeneration in a number of your explanations. Are they the same? What's the difference? And can you explain what each of them is?
Right, right. They're not exactly the same. Interestingly enough, I was asked that same question in an interview for a magazine article, and as the questions continued to come, because I've made my explanation, well, they're not the same. They're really different. I found that they're actually more similar. Even though I've been thinking about these as totally separate entities, particularly when I wrote the book, I realized that they're really not that different. And what I mean by that is traditionally rewilding has been considered or approached as a way to introduce apex predators and ecosystem engineers into the landscape, to rewild the landscape, beginning from the top down, basically. And so apex predators, say wolves in Yellowstone, or ecosystem engineers such as beavers, right? They build dams, they cut down trees, they really modify landscapes, and they create habitat for themselves, and they modify that habitat for other animals living in those systems, as well as organisms and other organisms such as plants. But when we broaden our view of rewilding, because wildness can exist anywhere, Paul Hawken, I remember hearing him speak recently, and he said, it can exist even in the cracks of a sidewalk. And so I'm still collecting information such as that. And it's helped me, the further I talk about these things and the further I look at them, it's helped me realize the regenerative process and rewilding aren't that different, that wildness can exist anywhere. And when we broaden our view of rewilding, we're then including ourselves in that process a little bit more, which I think is so important, because we're not separate from nature, we're integrally part of it. And then when we look at concepts such as biodiversity and the biodiversity hypothesis, we realize we are nature. And putting ourselves in the mix of this rewilding process, which is really wilding our food systems and our landscapes, even our container gardens and our patio gardens, through the simple process of using regenerative techniques. So that's where regeneration comes in. So wilding is fostering biodiversity on any number of levels, and welcoming wildness and being okay with wildness, and also I think rewriting the narrative or the wiring within us that a little bit of chaos is okay. And it doesn't mean our gardens have to be messy or totally chaotic in meaning disorganized, but that we welcome a cacophony, if you will, of animals to visit our garden, and we shift the baseline of our aesthetic and become okay with holes that are chewed in leaves. Those holes might have been chewed by the caterpillar of a monarch butterfly, the very species we're trying to welcome. So that's wilding or rewilding in a nutshell. And it doesn't have to just be those apex predators or ecosystem engineers. It could be pollinators of all kinds, welcoming insects, fostering biodiversity in soil through the regenerative process. And the regenerative process, regenerative gardening, is how I've scaled it from regenerative farming or regenerative agriculture. And it's the use of compost on soil, applying a compost layer of soil to feed that soil ecosystem, and keeping living roots in the ground. And that process of keeping living roots in the ground feeds soil, fosters soil health. And we can do that by growing perennials, companion plants, ground covers, and cover crops. That's another one I'm trying to remember. Skipping the use of pesticides, herbicides, and synthetic fertilizers, which break ecological systems and damage, if not kill, entire populations of organisms. These are some of the many regenerative principles that we can put into practice to rewild our gardens and our landscapes and ecosystems. And when you begin looking at these simple steps of regenerative growing, I'm sure many of the people who might be watching this or who visit your library realize, oh, I'm already doing most of those things. So I just maybe do them more, and I can benefit myself and my community. Oh, that's amazing. So hopefully that helps define the regenerative process is this process, these techniques, and rewilding is also a process, but it looks at this greater goal of fostering biodiversity.
That's great. I think, especially living in a suburb, I think we often associate like a manicured lawn as healthy looking and yeah, as a healthy yard, but that rewilding is challenging that and saying it's actually the opposite. You know, you should let it be. And I think there's one part of your book where you talk about, you know, oh, there's bunnies in your garden and you want to get rid of them, but should you really want to get rid of them? Because that means it's a welcoming place for critters. And I love that repositioning. And that the book really helps you do that, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. So there is an image in the book. I was lucky enough to visit a variety of gardens. While I'm in Northern California near the coast, I was able to visit, and I actually visit New England quite a bit. And there are at least 3 gardens from Massachusetts, 1 in Chicago, a couple, maybe 2 or 3 in Vermont, and there's one image in particular from Pam Carlson's garden in Chicago where there are bunnies. There were bunnies everywhere, and they were mostly feeding on her clover lawn. So she did have lawn, but her lawn is shrinking as she adds more native plants to her garden. And she's really focused on supporting migratory birds. She's right next to the Kennedy Expressway, and she's under the flyway of the O'Hare Airport. But she has this incredible bird life that comes to visit. And she sees hundreds of different birds every year. Some of those birds haven't been spotted in parts of Chicago for years, but they come to her garden. And the other part of her garden is that she invites bunnies. But her garden isn't decimated because the bunnies are there. In reality, there's this fabulous ecological balance. And her garden is a reminder of how vitally important our spaces are. When we think about the sheer number of acres dedicated to urban and suburban living, there's approximately 139 million acres and growing of acres of land dedicated to residential living, or whether that's in the city or the suburbs. And this is combined, this is more acreage than national and state parks combined, far more acreage, which is significant because when you consider these numbers, you realize, or at least I realize, how truly significant our landscapes are and the power our landscapes can have when considering issues like loss of biodiversity, species extinction, and the climate crisis, especially when we see them as these wonderfully rich places or potential places for rewilding our landscapes, and supporting migratory birds, bunnies, any number of species.
Yeah, that's amazing. The comparison. I didn't know that either. And going on to talking about our inner, you mentioned inviting animals. We were just talking about that. It brings up the concept of your nature quotient as a person. What exactly is that? How do you increase it?
Yeah, so your nature quotient is your basic understanding of nature and the natural world. And most people are familiar with your IQ, which is your ability to reason. Your emotional quotient is also a measure for intelligence, I guess you could say, that is commonly known and thought of. Your emotional quotient, your EQ, is your ability to interact and collaborate with others. Some say your EQ is a better measure for success in life than your IQ. Right? And I like to posit, well, what about your NQ? Considering where we are on the planet with the overabundance of carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and this precipitous rate of species extinction, it only makes sense that developing your nature quotient, your NQ, is also equally important for fostering healthy communities and healthy planet. The more we understand about nature, the more we can apply. And this can begin in our gardens. We grow better gardens when we pay attention. And that's really what our NQ asks us to do, is to simply pay attention and also spend time in nature, which is good for us too. Research has found that spending 120 minutes a week in nature boosts your cognitive abilities, increases concentration, decreases stress, elevates mood, even improves cardiovascular health. So there are these physical benefits. And then with time in nature and paying attention, we can then take those learnings. Oh, where's the path of the sun in the sky? Who's visiting? Which birds might be passing through at which time of year? Oh, I spotted a new bumblebee in my garden. I wonder which one it is. Oh, perhaps it's, a bumblebee that is at risk. And maybe if I grow more of these plants, I can support that bumblebee further. And what happens then, as we develop our NQ and we pay attention to developing our NQ, our nature quotient, and nature itself, there's a conversation, there's a dialogue that begins. And that dialogue translates not only into our own personal sense of happiness and health and connectivity, which I think is so important. I know many people probably felt the sense of being disconnected when the pandemic started, and so many of us were asked to stay at home and not drive to our favorite trailheads or visit our favorite parks, but stay at home, except to do essential business. And I think then many of us realized how deeply important our connectivity to nature truly is, and also each other, that we live in community with others, and that community includes nature. And so that NQ is part of that quotient, part of that process.
Yeah, so this is a very timely topic. And speaking of timely, talking about going into the next topic of how the different processes people can personally take on when they're creating their sustainable garden as gardening season approaches, at least here in Connecticut in the Northeast. You mentioned this a little bit earlier, but what are nature-based solutions?
Right. Nature-based solutions are just that. They're solutions that are derived from nature. We're basically doing our best to mimic nature to solve everyday problems. And lucky for us, this process of regenerative growing, not only does it rewild our communities, but the process of planting perennials, including trees, putting compost on soil, really supporting soil ecology, also has the ability then to hold more moisture, decrease flood events or the effects of flood events, and moderate temperature in communities. We know, for instance, that cities with more trees have the ability to moderate temperature better. In the summer, those high heat days have less of an effect. In particular, I think it's the high heat days to consider. We also know that cities with more trees have less crime. And so there are a number of nature-based solutions that not only impact us environmentally, but impact our societies collectively, as far as, I guess, equity in access to healthy communities. And trees is one of them.
And you also talk about something called the no dig approach.
Mm-hmm.
What is this, and can you do this with, some people buy pre-grown because they don't maybe have the time to grow inside from the seed. They buy them from the nursery that are pre-grown. Can you do the no-dig approach with multiple different types of plants in different phases of their growing?
Yeah, absolutely. And so no dig, great point. No dig is one of the many components, 5 or 6 components integral to the regenerative process. And the no dig approach basically asks us to disturb the soil as little as possible. And why is that important? Well, it's important for all the reasons we were just discussing in fostering biodiversity. And the no-dig approach, by disturbing the soil as little as possible, helps protect that soil ecosystem, which is then able to do some of the things we were just discussing, those nature-based solutions for increasing the water holding capacity of soil and moderating temperature, but also fostering biodiversity. And so no-dig, yes, it can happen in any instance, really. Typically when we think of no dig, we think of no dig out in landscapes, but there are also no dig principles for growing in containers and raised beds. So the basic idea is to layer organic materials on top of soil rather than digging down. And of course, there's some digging when you have to plant a plant. You need to create a hole big enough for the root system of that plant and then tuck it in. But you don't have to till up the entire area. You just need to dig a hole for the root system of that plant. And then you can add organic matter around the soil itself and on top of the soil. And again, this can happen in a landscape or in containers. And there's some examples in Grow Now of some great examples actually of this no dig process. One is a set of images that I absolutely love of a garden in a city center, and it's a garden being created by the employees of a pub, actually, the Steel and Hops Brewery and the natural food store across the street. And they've taken this barren strip of land, and with no dig, they've grown this incredible garden. And they haven't quite worked their way all the way to the corner. And so I used that photo of the corner of the property where there's nothing but dead grass and a few juniper trees. Otherwise, it's bare and it doesn't look at all inviting. They haven't reached that point yet. So that's sort of my before image. And then when you go further back down the curb on the sidewalk, you see where they've been growing the last couple of years. And in the middle is the transition zone where they've taken quite a healthy layer, 6 to 8 inches of compost. They've layered it on the soil. They put cinder blocks in front along the edge near the sidewalk in front of that soil. So between the wall and the sidewalk, basically lining the sidewalk to help keep that soil in place while the plants take root. Once the plants root, they can remove those cinder blocks, move them down the way once they are able to then add compost and plants to the remaining area towards the corner. And it's remarkable when people see the images of the finished garden that's been growing for a couple of years. They're able to plant intensively. There's this incredible variety of plants, which biodiversity begets biodiversity, as you mentioned earlier. So that diverse range of plants helps support biodiversity on the whole. It also means that we need fewer inputs because the ecology and the mix of those plants is doing much of the work, the companion planting or interplanting, if you will, of managing potential pests because of all the insects it brings. So it's truly remarkable what the downstream effects and the positive benefits are. But that's basically the no-dig approach, is layering soil. Now, when we're looking at the no-dig approach in containers or raised beds, we can simply see those containers as opportunities to compost in place and layer organic materials in a container, maybe much as you would with a compost pile. The smaller the container, the more I would go towards maybe using fewer of some materials than others, because you can't put a lot of material in a tiny container. But I talk about that in the book, and it's a really simple process, and it means we don't have to take soil from somewhere else. We can make soil with organic materials on hand, such as leaves and twigs and food scraps, and some finished compost on the top layer so you can plant right away.
Yeah, and that's great. We're gonna get to that in a moment with composting, with your demonstration, which I'm sure everyone watching is really excited about. I just wanted to go over one more key concept you talked about, which is companion planting. What is that when you're gardening, and can you give us an example of it?
Yeah, of course. So companion planting is essentially pairing plants, and you can use that word somewhat interchangeably with interplanting. So traditionally, companion planting, people will say, well, carrots love tomatoes, but never plant them with green beans. I'm just making this up. And what we know is there's not a lot of scientific proof about these plant pairings as far as which plants like each other and which plants don't. That said, I have found in my own garden, I really appreciate and love planting basil with tomatoes. Do I have any proof that that these plant pairings are truly beneficial to one another? Not exactly, but have I witnessed and seen the benefits over time? Have I always had success? Yeah, I have. So I keep pairing them together. Now, there are some instances where marigolds, for instance, can attract beneficial nematodes, but it takes a lot of those plants, and so that's the scientific end. If anyone has read some companion planting books, especially books from say 20 years ago, what we know now is that companion planting really works because of this effect of biodiversity upon biodiversity, and that when we mix our plantings, we're not planting a monocrop, or we're planting crops that are interplanted, a variety of plants. We are nurturing that ecology in the soil and above ground, which helps to moderate these populations. And another example of this would be to look at California strawberry growers, or strawberry growers anywhere. But there are a lot of our nation gets a lot of strawberries from California. And when you look at the practices of certain organic strawberry growers, what they do is they treat strawberries as an annual. And many people know, okay, strawberries are actually perennial, and they might not produce fruit for a lot of fruit after say year 3 or 4, but they're perennial. And with these organic strawberry growers, they treat them as an annual, and because they're growing a monocrop, right? They're growing just strawberries, at least in certain areas. And then after that year, they'll take those strawberries out and they'll plant brassicas like broccolis. And this is because the microbes associated with broccolis that have a relationship with broccolis, sort of like monarchs and milkweeds, is very specific. And the microbes, fungi in particular, that are associated with strawberries that can become pathogens when there's an overabundance of them, can become problematic if they're left in the soil over time, especially in these large monocrop settings. So by planting brassicas, they sort of cancel each other out. And then the next year they plant strawberries, the next year. So really that biodiversity of planting isn't just supporting, again, biodiversity above ground, but biodiversity below ground. It emboldens our plants, helps grow our plants, and decreases the need or eliminates the need for inputs such as pesticides and herbicides.
That's very interesting. I think that's something a lot of people don't know. And I think people listening once you pick up the book, you can see other examples for your own gardens. And now I believe you have something for us. You have some composting materials. So I guess my question is, I think a lot of us know what composting is, but do you have, you've talked about it throughout our questions so far. What is it, and is all compost created equal? And how can you compost in various settings, like an apartment building, a house, etc.?
Right. Great question. And I think that's probably the first one to address is, can I compost? Can I compost if I live in an apartment? Can I compost if I have a home but only a tiny yard? Or maybe I'm worried about rats. Maybe there's, I mean, that's a real concern, right? Rat issues and other rodent issues and attracting wildlife that you don't really want to have around your home. Or is it too much work? What if I fail? Well, having the right compost system or starting with a compost system that seems like a good fit is the best place to start. And in Grow Now, I cover a variety of different composting systems so that readers can begin sort of fine tuning which composting system might be the best for them, or which composting systems, because it might be you pair 2 or 3 different composting systems for the desired benefits, the desired outcome, managing kitchen scraps, for instance, leaves and yard waste. And so some of those systems are compost tumblers, a 1, 2, or 3 bin system, leaf mold, creating the leaf mold pile, worm bins, in situ, which is simply putting your compost, your kitchen scraps in the ground, digging a hole and putting them in the ground, burying it, and then moving over, or putting it directly into your veggie beds, or a bed like a keyhole garden system, which is designed to have compost in the middle, and then that composting action keeps the soil warm and is the source of microbes and nutrition for the plants that are growing nearby. So there are all these different composting systems that I mentioned in the book. And compost is the composting system is really feeding the decomposition process, and that happens around us in nature all the time. So nature makes its own compost when trees lose their leaves and animals come in and do the work of decomposing those leaves, whether those are tree leaves, as I mentioned, it could be grass leaves, it could be any other types of leaves, but it's plant matter. And what this points to is that it's life that makes life. And so composting is inputting these organic materials, these materials that were once living or were just picked and are basically still living, they're green, and putting them together with water and air. The microbes come and they decompose it into soil. And that's basically what composting is. And then there's of course, various techniques for composting depending upon which compost system you're using.
Great. And so what are the examples of the materials you have with you today?
Yeah, so I have my own, what I thought I'd start with is my own composting bowl that I use at home, where I throw all my goodies. So in here are my kitchen scraps. Kitchen scraps, I'm starting with kitchen scraps because if food waste were a country, it would be the number 3 climate driver behind the US and China. The amount of food that's wasted and goes into landfills is incredible. And we can easily solve this problem by composting these kitchen scraps. Now, when they go into the landfill, they produce methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And so if you were to do any one thing to positively benefit climate, it would be to compost, and specifically compost your kitchen scraps. And it's so easy. Even if you don't compost them at home, make sure they go to a composting hub in your community or nearby, maybe a green waste bin. But life creates life, right? So here is a kale stem from last night's salad. It's still alive. This is a green material. Browns and greens make compost. I have some carrot tops. Green materials, eggshells are high in calcium. You can also use eggshells in situ in the soil when you're growing tomatoes. If you find they have something called blossom end rot, where they're rotting at where the blossom once was, add eggshells to your soil. They're high in calcium, of course, right? Calcium. And then coffee grounds, or these are tea leaves. Even though they're brown, they're considered a green. They're high in nitrogen. They're almost like a compost activator, essentially. What else is in here? Oh, I had lilacs blooming recently, and I brought some in and had them in a vase. So more composting materials. There's even some tangerine peel in here, and citrus peels are compostable. One rule of thumb with citrus peels, or one thing that's important to remember, is if you're a really big citrus eater, say you eat lots of, or you use lots and lots of lemons or lots and lots of limes, or you're just a big orange eating family, to maybe hold back on some of the orange peels you're putting into your 3-bin system, and to leave out citrus from your worm bin, because the citrus is really hot and acidic, and those worms have very thin skins, right? And so it can be damaging to them. That's where your green waste bin comes in handy. So those are most of the materials in here. And then these can all go into my compost pile, and most of them are greens, which is really cool. Browns are another material. So I have some leaves here. So composting, I think what people get confused about with composting is when you look online and you Google, okay, what's the ratio of greens and browns? Oftentimes what comes up is 30% carbon to, or 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Well, this is really the ratio that the bacteria need, that the microbes need chemically to continue the decomposition process. But it's the makeup, it's the carbon to nitrogen ratio within the plant. It's not the amount of carbon and nitrogen. And green nitrogen, brown's carbon. And so to make it really simple is to consider when you're adding greens and browns. So leaves is an example of browns. When you're adding greens and browns to a typical compost pile, say a 1 or 2 or 3 bin system, a tumbler is another, that you can really just literally throw in 1 to 2 parts greens to browns. And they can be basically equal. Try it out, see how it goes. So you're not making your mom's chocolate chip cookies. It doesn't have to be precise. You're basically making a mix and match recipe of maybe garden soup from the garden. And whatever you have can go into the mix if you just follow this basic 50-50-ish. And then you try it out and you see how it works. If it smells good, looks good, and seems to be working, it's probably working. And if it's not, that's when you can begin troubleshooting. But it's these mix of browns and greens, kitchen scraps. You can even add paper. So if you have lots of paper bags, as long as you're sure they don't have a plastic coating, cardboard, certain packaging, you have to be really careful with. I want to note this because it can be hidden. Some to-go containers, while they look like cardboard boxes, they're actually many of them are lined with plastic. Those need to go into the trash. You need to see compostable on the container. And some of those containers, they say compostable, but if you look carefully and read the fine print, they need to go to a digester, meaning a high-powered composting system that is industrial level, not your home system. It depends on the material. If it feels like cardboard and it says compostable, it can go into your green waste bin. If it feels more engineered, then it might need to go to a digester, and that's when you put it into your green waste bin. So hopefully I didn't confuse everyone with that, but it's really simple. Think of your mom's, not your mom's chocolate chip cookies, but your mom's garden soup. 50-50, throw it in, greens to browns. If it's a worm bin, you're really only keeping enough browns, leaves, straw, newspaper, to top those worms, and the rest of it can be food scraps. And it's so simple. I talk about it in the book. It's not hard. It's really fascinating. And I have examples too of different qualities of compost, because one of the questions you asked was, well, are all composts the same? And they're not. They're not created equally. If you're making your own compost with kitchen scraps and leaves, it's probably the most amazing compost ever. But if you're buying compost, then you have to be really careful. And it's okay to buy compost because most of us don't make enough compost for our gardens. We have to source it from somewhere else. And lucky for us, there's more and more people, or more and more communities, I should say, that are coming online with community composting hubs, which are really important for all the reasons we were just discussing. That methane gas that's released when food scraps are going into the landfill, and the sheer number or sheer amount of kitchen scraps that go to the landfill. The more composting hubs come online, the more we can address the climate crisis in our communities.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation of the various materials that'll go into compost. And you said you had examples of finished. Yeah, great.
Yeah, so I have some finished compost. Let me actually just put this one over here. It's kind of big, and this one here. So it might be hard for viewers to see this, but I have 2 finished composts that were purchased. And one of them is a finished compost that when you read the label, it just says compost. It says ingredients, compost. That's it. Be wary. Buy only 1 bag when you see that on a bag. If you're curious, because it could be amazing. But it just said compost. In reality, let me move these leaves aside because I was using the same bucket. In reality, it's mostly fir bark. It has some perlite in it. And you can see that. I don't want to drop it on my computer keyboard, but I don't know if you can see that here. Let me do this. Here, my leaves are in there too. It's dry, it's fine. You can kind of see how it just falls out. It's mostly fir bark. Now, fir bark isn't bad, but it has these inputs like perlite. I'm not sure why they put perlite in there. Perlite is like a volcanic puffed up material that goes through heating. There's not really anything to it. I might use this compost mixed in with, since I own the bag, I will probably use it and pair it with coconut coir and make a seed starting mix out of it. There's not a lot to it, and seeds and seedlings don't need a lot of nutrition when they're getting going. Or you could use it just to add or basic organic matter to soil, but there's not a lot to that compost. It's not that exciting, but this compost is really exciting. And so what I want to show you here, I don't know if you can see it, but this compost, if you can see how crumbly it is.
Yeah.
It's dense, it's dark. It smells incredible. It smells like you want soil to smell. Right. And when you look at the bag, the ingredients on this one, yeah, it has some fir bark in it. It has different types of tree materials in it. It also has worm castings and chicken poop, chicken manure. It has all kinds of things in it, not just fir bark and perlite. And so those are 2 examples of finished compost that were purchased. And so what I recommend is to only purchase, if you're going to purchase compost in bags, only purchase 1 bag. See how you like it. Maybe try a few different bags and go from there. Or if you're lucky, maybe you have a composting hub, as we mentioned, where you could take your kitchen scraps and they also happen to make compost, and you can see it in bulk. And then get it in bulk so you can avoid the plastic bag and take it home in buckets or something.
Yes, actually, in fact, in Greenwich, they just started that, I believe last year or this year, where you can bring your scraps and you can get compost back. So we will provide all those resources underneath the video for people watching locally. But definitely every area has a different system, so it's good to look into that. That's really great. Thank you for showing that. I can really see the richness in that second one, and it's really, it's good to have that visualization of what it should look like.
And smell. Always use your sense of smell too, because when it smells good, there's bacteria in it, and it's always the good bacteria. That there's one bacteria that produces that soil-like smell, and it's a good sign when it's there.
Yeah, and in terms of starting our gardens and composting, if people want to do this, but they're kind of they're moving every year, they're living in an apartment, living in a city, what do you recommend for them? Maybe it's to go to your local garden or do something communal. But do you have anything if they kind of want to do it on their own in their own space? What is most ideal for those types of situations?
Yeah, I would suggest either keeping it mobile, keeping it light, using containers, containers that can be moved. Uh, I was, until a year ago, I was living in a rental and I wanted to stay nimble. I wasn't sure when we would move. I started out really small, and just the longer we stayed in this rental, the more containers I added. So it did end up being a lot to move in the long run. But I bought a trough, a watering trough, a stock tank, put holes in it and planted in that. Grow bags are a really great option. Sometimes you have to double those grow bags up. Putting casters on wine barrels. It's another excellent size container. They're movable, and you would have to empty them when you're moving, but it's still doable. Or keeping it really nimble and possibly growing in the ground and knowing that you're going to improve this space. You're going to create a garden space that you might one day leave and move, but being okay with that because you've benefited from it and the property is better for it, possibly. And then, of course, looking towards a community garden opportunity or a shared garden, which I think is a fabulous idea. I was lucky enough when I wrote Grow What You Love, I was renting. And I didn't, at the time, I was like, oh, I don't really want to add more containers because what if we have to move them all? I borrowed a garden. I had a friend who wasn't using her garden, and the expense I put into it was improving the soil and fixing the irrigation. And I got to grow in it for a couple of years, and it was a real gift. And they loved it too because I would share extra produce with them. And another example of a shared garden, I was photographing Grow Now, and I was helping photograph a couple of other books in 2020. I said yes to every bit of work in 2020 because I didn't know what was around the corner, as so many of us. I'm sure it was the same for so many of you. I came across this garden, and it was a community garden in someone's backyard. This woman lived in this house, beautiful home with this big back hillside and she loved growing food, but she couldn't do it all herself. And so she invited 2 or 3 families from the community, or opened it to the community, and had 2 or 3 families at a time gardening in her backyard space and sharing that space. And it was really incredible. And I think that sharing economy, because it can seem daunting, or perhaps you're not lucky enough to have your own space, or maybe your space is too big and you really want to share that process. Again, we live in community, and reconsidering the sharing economy that when I was a kid was so popular. Go get this sugar from Mrs. Molander, or Mrs. Molander, our neighbor, would, I'd go get sugar from her, and she'd send me home with cuttings or seeds from my mom. And that was really commonplace. I think bringing back this idea of a sharing economy is a really wonderful way for people who are highly mobile, whether they're college students or maybe their jobs are just transitioning quite quickly, or they have to move for work quite often, is a great way to still grow and have that be part of your life because it's so beneficial to us, even growing a few things and making it doable and manageable.
I'm glad you bring up that point because we are so individually focused, and a lot of people think, oh, why improve this yard if I'm going to move next year? But you're improving it for the earth, you're improving it for the next person, you're improving it for the good of everyone. So thank you for bringing up that aspect of community. I know that's a big focus of the book, and this is actually a perfect segue into the next topic of why this matters. Environmental justice is a huge issue right now. Social justice, environmental justice is a subsect of that. What is environmental justice in the context of, and in the context of gardening, community gardens? How can environmental justice be, rectified via gardening, community gardens, etc.?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a really good point. It's interesting because I think many of us, or at least the common vision or stereotype of gardening and gardeners is that it's a cute hobby, when really gardening and growing is acutely urgent. It's something that we can do today to empower our own lives, feed our children or our families healthy food. We know that children who eat more fruits and vegetables, children who grow some of their own food tend to eat more fruits and vegetables. That the same is true for adults. And there's this wonderful downstream effect. Now, around environmental justice, it's very much the same, right? So environmental justice, the how it's referred to technically is creating equity in environmental policy, environmental decision making, and and um, and really empowering people of all different races, genders, nationalities to be part of that process. You can also look at environmental justice as creating fairness in how do I put this? Well, I guess the reverse is, say, for instance, the impacts of negative environmental inputs, such as toxic pollution, increased pollution, the effects of resource extraction, and sometimes the negative benefits or negative effects of that, fracking on, affecting water, etc., oftentimes affect low income groups, and it increases the racial income divide. And groups that are disenfranchised tend, or have been traditionally disenfranchised, tend to be affected more than other groups. And in the context of gardening and growing, when we go back to, well, children who grow their own fruits and vegetables tend to eat more fruits and vegetables. This is something we can bring immediately to our communities that are considered food deserts, communities that have very few trees. When I went to photograph one of the gardens in Grow Now, it's in Watts in LA. And I know this isn't just in LA, but you're driving through LA and you're in sort of a suburban neighborhood, looks like what you would expect of any suburban neighborhood. Then all of a sudden you cross this line and you're in Watts, and there's no trees, there's very little plant life, it's all concrete. And I didn't see a grocery store, I saw convenience stores. And what I'm describing is very common. It happens in most city centers, in some part of a city center, or some suburban areas that are that tend to have these racial or economic divides. And we can begin righting that ship, righting that issue, by planting trees, bringing in nature, creating gardens that are open to everyone, which is what I was going to photograph. I went to Watts to photograph this community garden. It's not a community garden and everyone can have a plot. It was more of a community program that invited people to come in for workshops. There was a flower farm where people could get on-the-job training in the flower arts, from growing them to creating bouquets, becoming a floral designer. There was a culinary program, on-the-job training for not only growing the food, but preparing the food, where people then could leave and get employment. And then in the meantime, there's this food source, there's this place for people to go, there's this place for people to commune and be together and celebrate their cultures and celebrate their foods, because these were people from all different walks of life. And here in these gardens, people could grow, say, the herbs that are specific to their villages where they maybe grew up in China or in Southeast Asia, or maybe they didn't have access to various fruits and vegetables, and it was their place to learn about these foods and learn how to prepare them and cook with them. And this particular garden in Watts isn't the only garden program running a program like this, but it reminded me of how important these garden spaces truly are, as these spaces to commune, but also learn and begin. It doesn't solve all the problems, but begin creating equity and access to nature, which is, for me, I believe, part of environmental justice is creating equitable access to nature, and increasing those opportunities by regenerating and rewilding our communities and our landscapes.
Yeah, you get more than a garden. You get all the other great things that come with it. I love that. And another great segue into our, talking about traditions and growing up. You mentioned in the book, you talk about native traditions. So, a lot of these concepts we talk about, rewilding, regenerating, the prefix we use. So none of this stuff is new. We are reasserting these processes that were once there, but industrialization has messed up our planet so much that we have to start them over again. So nothing sustainable is reinventing the wheel. And a lot of our sustainability practices are inspired from native practices. Is there anything we could learn from native practices? I know you specifically talk about the sister crops. Is there anything we can learn about from them and bring that into our own gardens?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because in reality, the regenerative process is a process that's so old it seems new. And yes, people of all walks of life have used this process. And really, the regenerative process is mimicking nature as best we can. What we know is that indigenous cultures many traditionally used these regenerative techniques that are so old they seem new, to grow food. And food is, I mean, it's important to everyone, right? Food is life. But different cultures have different approaches to food. And when it comes to examining the importance, or what do indigenous cultures have to teach us, the sky is the limit. We have narrowed down the amount of foods that we typically eat. We've narrowed it down to really the things that transport well and that can hold up in the grocery store. And we've lost a lot of knowledge around foods. And when we start diving into seeds and the potential to grow foods you've never even heard of, we're really diving into the culture and the history of Native peoples and indigenous cultures. And part of that is bringing those foods back to people who maybe have lost them, like the Navajo, for instance. There's certain government programs. When you were talking about industrialization, there's also colonialization. And there was a program for many years called government cheese, and that might have been just the slang for it, where peoples were separated from their foods. And they were given, there's like, well, you don't need your farmland. We need your farmland. And instead we're going to give you canned this or that and government cheese. And it's really sad when you think about that happened. It's devastating. And this process of regenerating, while once very much practices of indigenous peoples, part of regenerating is bringing back these food systems to people who are disenfranchised from their food systems and their crops. So we have so much to learn from each other, and particularly these native cultures that live very close to nature and very close to their foods. One of the things that I love so much about the Three Sisters planting, which we can talk about, and plants in general through many cultures, through many indigenous cultures, are the stories that go with these plants. So they don't just name the plant, well, this is a carrot and this is a celery and this is a plum. There are stories that go with each of these plants, and the stories not only describe the plant, and how the plant looks, it describes the plant's ways. Oftentimes these stories describe the plant in relationship to the greater environment and the interconnection, again, of reminding us of the interconnection of all things. And the Three Sisters is one example. The Three Sisters is a very common companion planting grouping of corn, beans, and squash. And there are many stories And many native cultures have their own version of the Three Sisters planting, but typically, or the story I'm the most familiar with, is the story of and I'll just summarize this quickly. There are three sisters. One's corn, one's beans, and one is squash, and they live together because the corn is the tall stalk that the beans can climb up and find support on, and the squash cover ground and protect and insulate the ground. They hold in moisture, all those big leaves. They help moderate soil temperature and the transpiration of moisture from the soil. And they work together. They also, squash also helps reduce competition by other plants, right? Because they're underneath that corn and that squash. And so they live together. It's a fabulous plant pairing because they collaborate. But in this story, these sisters, they live together in nature, and this boy comes, and he's whittling his stick, or he's out exploring something. The three sisters watch him, and then eventually, one by one, the sisters disappear. And finally, the third sister, the squash, the boy hears her crying, he brings her home, and she finds her sisters are there, and she's reunited with her sisters. And it's really the story about how people acquired these foods, and again, how these foods naturally grew with one another, or apparently grew with one another in nature. But really, it's the story of how people found their foods and how we can use these qualities of plants to grow them together. And there are many stories of plants and how they grow. And we have so much to learn and from these stories. And also, when we're thinking about our nature quotient, there's so much insight into plants if we begin thinking of them as these living, spiritual, thinking beings. And anyone who's read The Secret Life of Trees or Finding the Mother Tree, I think is the book, there's scientific evidence about how plants communicate, how plants smell, and how plants think and feel. And it's really quite fascinating. And when we open ourselves up to that, even in some small way, it increases, I think, our appreciation for nature and reminds us of the interconnection of all things.
Yeah, thank you for that inspiring note. It's really great to learn about these relationships, and I think it is, since we're coming to the end of our talk. I think it's taking us out on a positive note. But now that we've kind of discussed all these concepts, and you do talk a little bit about eco-anxiety, how do you think now, what do you think is kind of the best next step for someone watching? Maybe they don't know where to begin out of what we've talked about to kind of calm their eco-anxiety. The problem is so big. Should it be, should it be starting a garden right away? Should it be being a citizen scientist? You have some solutions at the end. What is your favorite? What are a few of your favorites?
Yeah, that's a great question, because eco-anxiety is very real. That feeling when you turn on the radio in the car and you realize, oh, this is news I don't want to hear, and you have to turn it off right away. We have to be selective, or just feeling overwhelmed, and maybe feeling like it's hard to make decisions. Those are all symptoms of eco-anxiety, and just being stressed and overwhelmed. And even when we don't have words for it, it's there in the background. It's hard not for it to be there when we're looking at extreme weather events, wildfires, hurricanes. I mean, massive flooding. It's overwhelming. But we can address eco anxiety at home, and yes, it can be hard to know where to begin. My go-to answer for that is to start small, grow what you love, which is the title of my first book. And even if you grow one thing, and you will immediately feel better. There's something really wonderful about going into a space, working with plants. It goes back to the biodiversity hypothesis, this exchange of microbes on a scientific and physical level, but also simply looking at plants reduces stress and elevates mood. And just think of the benefits of touching and working with plants. It's real. And whenever I get to a point in my day where I need to be off the screen, I need to stop, I need to unplug, I go in my garden, and within 5 minutes, I feel so much better. Even when I had a tiny garden, I have a bigger garden now, but even when I had my deck garden, that was the case. Even if I just sat in the garden and watched what was happening, I immediately felt better. So there's immediate relief to eco-anxiety. And then there's hope from action. And so if you feel like you don't have a space to grow a garden of any kind, maybe it's even just planting a tree. I mean, maybe you could do that, right? Something that takes very little care. Pam Carlson in the book, she grows a tree she calls her bird tree. It's a hawthorn. And she claims that tree is one of the reasons she has so many birds in her yard. So even if it's planting a tree, there's hope from that action, right? You're immediately doing something to foster soil ecology and bird life and other insects and insects. And it's simple, it doesn't take a lot of time. And then composting, there's hope from action, composting, knowing that if you could do one thing, composting is, wow, also really important. And when we begin this process and we find success in our own lives, we also, and begin the process and learning along the way, we also begin developing the language within ourselves and for speaking with others about this process. And one of the things I pull out in the book are these words with re in front of them, that prefix: rewild, restore, regenerate. And those words are so important because words do create worlds. And those are words from Dr. Claudia Gross, who I also mentioned in the book, that language and shifting the language, shifting the narrative for how we see things, and incorporating words like regenerate, rewild, restore, restory, allows us to begin seeing our landscapes in a new way. And that new way may be the very best hope we have for mitigating the climate crisis and species extinction, beginning at home with our own two hands. And there's real evidence to show that each of our tiny acts has big impacts. Because think about my garden or my compost pile and your neighbor's compost pile, and so on and so on. Together they work together to create, or together they work together. They work together to create wildlife corridors, nectar paths, living greenways that connect parks to homes, to community gardens. And they weave together then, creating greater habitat, not just for nature and wildlife, but for ourselves. Creating that equity we were speaking about, relationship to environmental justice and healthy, resilient communities. So it's a cascading positive effect that we get to be a part of, and it's so simple.
Yeah, thank you for those final thoughts. I love that you mentioned restory. Thank you for restoring us with today, sitting with us today and kind of talking about something that's, a tradition as old as time, but it's being used like new again. I hope everyone watching has been able to kind of reshape their thinking about their own gardens, about the collective gardens and the collective health of the planet. Check out Grow Now at Greenwich Library. And yes, we both have our copies, Greenwich Library, or at your local library if you're watching from somewhere else, and your local bookstore as well. And I hope everyone's been invigorated. I know I have been, as the gardening season especially approaches us in the Northeast. I know it's a little different in California, but I hope everyone's inspired from this conversation. I know I am. Thank you for having this great chat with me and with us today, Emily.
Oh, thank you, Emma. Thanks for reaching out to me, and I hope that this conversation is helpful to others, and that we can work some magic, find some meaning and hope, and enact real positive change that benefits ourselves and our communities.